Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Chris Blankenhorn, and I am one of the organizers of the Green Socialist Organizing Project's Education Working Group. I'm also a former GPUS Green Party United States National Co-Chair and was the Hawkins Walker 2020 Social Media and Tech Director. Like I said, thank you for joining us. This is our Ecosocialism 101 training. This is part of a series of 101 trainings that we have been doing quarterly this year. We are the Green Socialist Organizing Project. So we cycle through and do Green Party 101, Socialism 101, and Organizing 101. We did them in January, February, March, and then we reset again for this monthly series in April, May, and June. So if you want to learn more about the series, you can go to greensocialist.net/101s with an S on the end. And that will give you videos from our previous ones, registration links, and information about the upcoming ones. So that is one of the education series we have going on in the Green Socialist Organizing Project. The other one that I'm going to mention before we kind of get rolling is our campaign training series. Our campaign trainings have been 2 a month for the last couple months, and they will continue into June. In April, we did campaign systems and Green New Deal as our 2 workshops. In May, we did petitioning and Medicare for All, which was this last Sunday with Margaret Flowers. And then in June, on June 5th at 7 p.m., we have campaign communications, media, and social media. And then on June 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern, we have peace and anti-imperialism. So those are different workshops that we've been doing. That campaign training series has 1 workshop each month in 2 different areas. The first area is kind of nuts and bolts campaigning. So that would be the tech and systems, the petitioning, social media. And then the second one each month is on an issue. So that would be the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and peace. We've been putting those on in the hopes of kind of providing a basic skill set for our candidates, but also to help our candidates and Greens, around the country start to develop a common language on some of our core issues, right? So on Sunday with Margaret Flowers presenting on Medicare for All, she broke down some of the problems with both Representative J. Paul and Senator Sanders' Medicare for All proposals, talked about what we should be fighting for, and gave an outline of what a Green position on Medicare for All should be and how it differs from that of progressive Democrats. So we've got our 2 series that we've been running. Like I said, there's campaign trainings. You can find them at greensocialist.net/campaign-trainings. And then the 101s, which this is one of them. This is our Ecosocialism 101. And you can find more information about those, watching past events and seeing and registering for future ones at greensocialist.net/101s with an S on the end. Like I said, my name is Chris Blankenhorn. And I'm one of the organizers with the Green Socialist Organizing Project's Education Working Group. I'm going to turn it over to Garrett, who will introduce himself, and he'll kind of roll into the presentation. The 2 of us will, kind of go back and forth a little. If you've got questions and are on Zoom, go ahead and type them in the chat, and we'll try to get them, as we fly if it fits, or we'll pause when it's appropriate to grab the question. And the same thing goes for watching on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, we will be watching the comments section, and we'll pull comments that we, questions and things that we see. So with that, Garrett, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My name is Garrett Wasserman, and I'm a current Green Party of the United States Steering Committee co-chair. And I've been involved in my state party, the Green Party of Pennsylvania, for I don't know, 6 or 7 years now. And I've worked on ballot access for several of our campaigns. And so, I've been active in the Green Party at various levels. And, this presentation is part of a 101 series, like Chris mentioned, for folks that are new to the Green Party and new to green politics, that, if you come from a different background, for example, many of our members previously worked on a Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, and they've come over to try to build out, a more socialist perspective on what the United States needs. So if you come from any of those other backgrounds and you're not really sure what socialism is, or even if you've heard of socialism or social democracy or something like that, you're not really sure how that plays into green politics. Well, these presentations are for you. So hopefully it'll help answer some questions, or at least point you in the right direction where you can read more and you can ask us questions and things like that. So without any further ado, we'll do Socialism 101 here, where a very broad overline of socialist thought. There's obviously a lot to this. Can't do it all in one presentation. So we're just going to try and hit the highlights and just kind of explain some terminology and some thoughts and how that plays into green politics, how that informs our organizing within the Green Party and green movement overall. So before we get into the real content, I just kind of want to start with a little mindset here that I think is something that's important to think. Because a lot of times when we start talking about politics, we start getting into these very technical descriptions of economics and this policy and this percentage and taxes and all. And before we even get there, I think we need to just start with the mindset, which is, why are we doing politics in the first place? Why are we doing any of this? And I think it actually gets down to a very deep question, which is, what do we want out of our lives? What do we want our life to look like? Is it just that we want to be wealthy and have money? Or is it that we want to have time to hang with friends, to be with family, to, if you're old enough to have kids, if you have kids, spend more time with your kids, or spend time with your parents or your grandparents or whatever, to pursue hobbies and interests and solve creative, interesting challenges in your community, maybe science, maybe engineering, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. The point is, let's think about, what do we want to accomplish with our politics, and what is our goal for that? And I think having this mindset around the conversation that'll come will really kind of help think about the challenges that we're going through when we talk about what is capitalism and what is socialism and how we get from one to the other.
Real quick,
go ahead.
I just want to say, I think that it's really important that we center that kind of mindset, right? The reality is that what socialists propose is a radical transformation of our society. It's a very precarious proposition. It's one without a clear path, right? Because current and previous socialist projects, while often criticized, and we should give critical support to them, haven't succeeded in overthrowing capitalism. So we need to make sure that we're keeping the broad values in mind when we're out talking, because there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be things that we don't know, there's going to be policy questions that don't have clear answers, that we're going to try things and some things are going to work and some things are not going to work. Right, so it especially when our political culture and our broader culture in general really focuses in on exact immediate answers to things. The kind of radical transformation that we're talking about is not something that always has an immediate and clear and 100% accurate answer. So making sure that we're always rooting ourselves in these values, these core values of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to build for, what we want as a future, it's really important that we keep those things as centered as we can, because if we don't, we're going to get bogged down in policy wonk stuff. We're going to get pulled we're going to become the squad, right? We're gonna get into power, and we're gonna get pulled right by the urge to be productive within a system that doesn't want the same thing as we do. And we're going to sacrifice our values for and our goals for short-term stuff. So it's always important when we're having, this is a big thing that we're talking about, right? Overthrowing capitalism is a massive, massive undertaking, a massive proposal. And so we really have to make sure that, even as we get deeper and we see successes and failures, that we're always kind of returning and refreshing ourselves with that core idea of what we want and what we're trying to do.
Yep, exactly. Totally agree. So let's kind of keep that mindset here that we're trying to look at broader change and not just dabble in the technical stuff. That's, like Chris said, what'll happen within typical Democratic Party politics is even among the most progressive folks, they'll start arguing about, well, 40% tax rate on the rich is more progressive than the 35% tax rate. And it becomes so arbitrary and abstract, and it's disconnected from what do we actually want out of life. So, that's a very important mindset to keep as we
And it's important to understand too that, socialist policy is not a gradation, slightly to the left of a liberal progressive policy, right? One of the reasons that the Green Party is a socialist party, is an eco-socialist party, is because if we are just a slight shade to the left of the progressive wing of the Democrats, what's the point of being the Green Party, right? What we are calling for is not the same thing that's being called for by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who's more calling for a capitalist social democracy, a la what you see in Europe. What we're calling for is an end to private ownership and an end to capitalism, and putting socialism in its place. So, it's important that we are explicit in our socialism, because that is something that really, really separates us from even the left flank of the Democratic Party.
Yep, exactly. So maybe I should have added this to our outline here. A good starting point. So anyway, let me do our quick outline here and we'll get into it. So there's basically three main sections to the presentation today. First, I think before we can effectively talk about socialism, we have to talk about what socialism is not, how it compares to today's system, which is referred to as capitalism. So we'll talk a little bit about what capitalism is from a different perspective than you've probably heard it from other sources. We'll then talk about what socialism is and class struggle and just kind of like very basic concepts in socialism, and some of the arguments and disagreements between various socialist movements that we call tendencies. These are some of the unanswered questions that Chris was kind of hitting on a little bit there, that there hasn't been a global revolution against capitalism yet. So a lot of the questions about what does it look like when we get there are not completely answered yet. So, we're working through it, but working through it toward our values, right? Toward what we want out of life. And then the third section will be very brief notes, obviously not a comprehensive history of some socialist struggle in the US, in particular, how it relates to where the Green Party came from, our socialist roots that really informed the beginning of the Green Party. And then lastly, we'll close out with a little kind of conclusion and where to go next. So you can look forward to these sections here. So first, we're going to start with what is capitalism? This is, of course, a really complex subject. One question might be, where did capitalism come from? Or in some sense, how did we get here, right? Like, we're watching this thing on YouTube or whatever it is. How did society reach this point? How did we get here where I've got to work a job at least 40 hours a week? A lot of people work 60 or 80 hours a week. You got to do that so you can get money to survive. If you're sick, you got to pay a doctor money. And, how did we get here? How did society get to this point? That is its own really complex question, because humanity as a species goes back hundreds of thousands of years. We don't even necessarily know what early humans were doing completely. But from what we're piecing together of early human history, and this will kind of come back up a little bit later, early humans were a lot more communal, cooperative, more of an egalitarian type of society. And over time, because of various influences, various groups have come to power over the others. Some of the earliest forms of people coming to power and dominating others is gerontocracy, for example, which is ruled by the elderly, because at first the elderly knew stuff, right? Like they knew about crop rotations and how to survive droughts and various things. And it kind of grew into various forms of religious things, into monarchy, into business and commercial oligarchy, all of these things that we see a progression over time that, through like the Middle Ages and feudalism and kings and stuff like that. And as the old feudal state began to collapse and people didn't take, kingdoms and stuff that seriously anymore, you saw these commercial business oligarchies rise to kind of take their place as kind of the leaders of communities and societies. And that was essentially the start of capitalism, and the idea of a nation state, of these countries that, have leaders and they interact with each other and stuff like that, which is a very different concept for how society works compared to earlier forms of human civilization and society that were, again, a lot more cooperative and treated people more or less as equals within the community structure. So modern capitalism, we'll come back to this in a little bit in a moment, but modern capitalism, you can kind of think of a few different takes on it. One is the social democratic structure, which is kind of what we think of with a safety net, with like having Social Security and Medicare and things like that, where people are taken care of, at least at very basic needs, but you still got to work in this very industrialized, technocratic, hierarchical type of society where, there's rulers, there's people that make decisions above everyone else. There's also neoliberalism, which is probably a term you've heard, which is kind of this intense focus on the markets as the answer to everything, that you let the market decide. You've probably heard that. So you've probably heard these terms and all. So let's kind of dig a little bit more into exactly what all this stuff means. So for one thing, from a socialist perspective, when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about not just an economic structure. It's usually painted as a form of economics with the market and stuff like that. But really, capitalism at this point is a whole type of society and structure, a whole type of culture that dominates our politics, dominates the way that we interact with each other and the way that we treat each other. There's many different ways you can view this. One that's an interesting way is this short essay, "What is Capitalism?" by Peter Staudenmayer. Oh God, I hope I pronounced that correctly. In any case, in this essay, he identifies 4 unique characteristics of capitalism that kind of set it apart from other types of societies and economic systems that we've seen, both in history, but even existing today in various ways. The first aspect is that you see the economy especially, but even society as a whole, become commoditized. And this means everything is wrapped up with like a dollar sign, basically. Everything is designed for exchange on a market. So instead of producing things because someone needs it, it's produced because, hey, if I sell it on the market, I'll make money. And so you have this kind of disconnect from production and need already in capitalism, because it's a focus on how do we make the profits, how do we make the wealth, how does somebody get more wealthy, get more get more money. And this kind of invades the rest of our culture and society too, where we kind of treat each other in these very transactional sort of relationships. We treat it. Yeah, go ahead.
And under capitalist commoditization, products that improve human need that aren't profitable go by the wayside, right? So one of the things, and I'm sure we'll probably get to some of the things that capitalism has to say about socialism, or capitalists have to say about socialism. But one thing you often hear is about innovation. But in many ways, capitalism stifles innovation if it is not profitable. An example we talked about on Sunday on the call about Medicare for All was the Lyme disease vaccine. Right, there's a vaccine that would stop that can prevent Lyme disease, this horrible disease. It wasn't profitable, and there wasn't a large enough market demand to make money. So the pharmaceutical company that holds the patent stopped producing it. You can no longer get a successful vaccine because the company that owns the rights to it can't make money off of it. That's a case of innovation for human need that improves people's lives being thrown away and being shuttered and kept away from the general public because there's no money making aspect to it. And you can see that in especially in the healthcare industry. Where you've got, there's been quotes from, pharmaceutical leadership saying that there's no money in curing cancer, right? So if profit is your, that's the thing that, is central to capitalism. Innovation is not the goal. Profit is the goal. And innovation that doesn't create profit is not supported under a capitalist system.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually just sharing on social media the other day that a 60 Minutes report just came out saying that they did some big study and found all kinds of medication in the US is we have shortages of various medications because they're not profitable, because the companies decided that they just don't want to make it. They just don't make enough money on it. So why would they focus on it? So
the
that's
other side is you go full Martin Shkreli.
Right.
And you jack up the price of something that's life-saving because if the pharmaceutical industry said we're not going to produce insulin because it's not profitable, you might actually see a move for something of like getting rid of their rights to those patents and opening up public production, because insulin is something that's so absolutely essential for people that need it. Like, it's a life or death thing.
Yeah.
So shuttering it away like they did with the Lyme disease isn't a possibility if you're producing insulin. So what do? They then make insulin profitable by drastically jacking up the prices.
Yeah, exactly. So these first 2 points here, basically, that everything becomes commoditized so that it can be sold for maximum profit. And we have this outsized role of markets in our society, and the markets are what really drive this profits as the top motive. You've always got to make more profit. And even when you make record-setting profits, it's still not enough, right? There still always has to be more for the investors. We'll get back to that point in a moment. But the market relationships here prioritize profit and set up this dynamic where one person has kind of the power in a relationship, right? They own the thing you need, insulin or whatever it is in the most serious cases, but even lesser things, they have the thing that you need, and so they can set the price. They can set the rules. Essentially, you have to do what they want in order to get the thing that you might need. And that sort of consumer relationship is everywhere in society. So that's its own problem to tackle. Related to all we were just talking about medications and all, that's considered property. It's considered private property in general, intellectual property, but private property in general. That's a very important concept to capitalism, because that is how capitalists, folks that want to, make more profit and stuff like that, that is how they do so. They claim exclusive ownership over these things so that they can control who has access to it and, charge the money that they want and all the stuff that goes along with it. And then finally, the final characteristic of capitalism identified in this particular essay is exploited labor. So the folks that are producing all of the commodities and the property and things like that are not the ones that actually own it or control it or get any decision making in it, right? They just kind of have to accept the decision making of the property owners, which are the wealthy capitalists and things. At the worst, this can become flat out chattel slavery, where humans are owned for their labor. But even in a wage type society that we live in today, folks are still exploited. You're not paid what you're actually producing, right? It's most of the profits, well, you know what I mean. All the profits, technically speaking, go to the folks that claim that exclusive private ownership. It doesn't go to the person that actually made it, and then you don't get any say so in what happens with that product, like who uses it. Are you going to produce something that goes to create weapons, or whatever? There's lots of decisions that go into economics and production and things, and the bottom line is that workers are not included in any of that. So these four characteristics altogether kind of define capitalism, or at least describe it. Many of its most important characteristics that set it different from other types of societies that could exist. And one phrase that I like is this grow or die imperative in capitalism. That capitalism always encourages more and more production because it needs more and more profits. And because it's related to this market thing, it's kind of equated that to get more profits, I have to produce more things. So there's always this drive to always produce more and more and more, which means squeezing labor, squeezing more and more out of workers, but it also means squeezing more and more out of the planet, out of our resources, out of the ecology. So capitalism is not only a social crisis, but it's leading to ecological crisis. And that's an important point for ecosocialism, right, that we'll come back to.
And the grow or die also, drives conflict.
Yeah.
We live on a finite planet with finite resources and finite markets. We're largely at a point in modern society where there aren't new markets, right? The days of expanding around the world are kind of gone. Capitalism has expanded around the world, so we've lost the ability to continue expanding the size of the pie, I guess, for the lack of a better analogy. The pie has reached kind of maximum size, so now it's all about exploiting more labor, exploiting more natural resources, and deriving your profit in other ways, because there's really not a whole lot of places where you can kind of deliver your product to a new group of people that haven't had access and expand market-wise like that. So, the grow or die imperative is very much plays out in geopolitics, and why we have a world that's constantly at war rather than serving the needs of the people.
Yeah, exactly. So, these aspects of capitalism lead to, oppression and exploitation of people, of workers, of the planet, of natural resources, and then it drives all this conflict, war and things. So, capitalism is very much at the root of many of the problems we face today. And that is basically the central thesis of what ecosocialism is about. That in order for us to handle the problems that we're facing, the social, the ecological, and end war and things like that, is that we have to deal with capitalism. We have to change away from this type of society and system. Before we get more into what socialism is, which kind of helps inform what socialism is actually, is this essay, The 7 Left Myths of Capitalism, which is a really great way to think about capitalism and kind of decouple it from the propaganda that we hear in our various media sources and things. Folks that are not that familiar with socialist history and theory and things can sometimes be taken in by these myths that on the surface sound correct and sound right. And, maybe they even touch on something that's true there, but there's a deeper analysis that we have to get into to really understand what's going on. And so, for one example, one of the myths is that greed is what's driving all this. And so it'll lead folks into kind of fake solutions where they think, well, greed is driving up the price of insulin, and also if we just set some controls and some regulations and things like that, it'll all work out, it'll all fix. But tweaking the percentages and all these things doesn't address the fact that there's patents on these medications, for example. It doesn't address the grow or die imperative under a capitalist market. It doesn't address all of the systemic issues underneath all of this. So at best, you're only going to get some level of temporary relief. It's not actually going to address the problem in a long-term way for everybody. And, greed is one of them, but other myths include corruption, which usually gets translated into, we just need the right people, right? We just need the right business person or the right person in office or something like that, right? And again, because of all these systemic pressures, it doesn't matter a whole lot, really, who that person is, in terms of the whole entire system and how all of the various parts of the market and everything work together. Sure, corruption can and does exist, but addressing corruption is, again, not going to address all of the systemic problems underneath capitalism that have to do with, again, the private property, the exploitation, the grower-die imperative, all of that stuff. If that's still underneath there working, then you haven't really solved the problem. And same goes for blaming Wall Street. Again, yes, Wall Street and monetary policy do play its role. Yes, Wall Street does take advantage of us and take our money and all. But again, just trying to make a more fair financial system, monetary policy, doesn't address the systemic things under the market and capitalism. Trying to produce more competition. A lot of times they'll say, well, it's big corporations. If we break up the banks, right? Break up the big corporations, have lots of small competition, we'll fix it. Again, that competition doesn't fix the grow or die imperative, where they have to grow, and now they have to outcompete each other to make sure that they're not winning each other, or losing to each other, right? So now it's actually kind of encouraging the grow or die even more cutthroat behavior, because they want to centralize power and wealth, and they have to keep growing, grow or die imperative.
Well, and when you look at think the idea that if we all went back to small business, small businesses don't have the benefit of economy of scale. So they have to get their profits again from somewhere else, whether that be exploiting their labor force or finding, cheaper, lower quality materials. Just going to small business, like you said, doesn't solve any of those problems. And, I obviously with any, job or any, employment, there's always quite a bit of variation in how you're treated and things like that. But, small businesses are often no better and many times worse than big corporations and things like that when it comes to how they treat their employees and the levels of exploitation and such.
Yeah, exactly. So, these are all touching on something that does exist, but not addressing the systemic push that's going to exist regardless. So folks that, may start off thinking about greed or corruption or big corporations or something, when they kind of recognize how much the game is stacked against you, so to speak, under capitalism, just because of all those systemic pressures, unfortunately, some folks that can bring them down the path to reactionary conspiracy type things that, like, oh, it's happening this way because somebody's making it happen. There's some scary group that's pulling the strings behind the scenes and making sure that this happens. And again, it's not that never happens, but it's ignoring the systemic nature of capitalism, of, again, the market pressures and the grow or die imperative and things. It doesn't take a conspiracy to cause all this. It's just how human interactions work right now.
It's also, easier, kind of from the perspective of how you grasp things and how you understand these problems that we're facing. It's easy to think that there's a person, right? And don't get me wrong, there are people, right? There are people who are behind this and they need to be held accountable. But like we said, kind of in the corruption thing, you switch out the CEO of Shell's going to do damage no matter what. Right? It doesn't really matter who's in that position. And the same can be said looking at, the highest office in the country, the presidency. We're seeing the damage of capitalism playing out under both of our capitalist parties, which isn't surprising, right? But it's hard and it's big when you start thinking in terms of systemic stuff, because it's not, if we remove X person, then the problem is solved. It's much bigger than that. It's much deeper than that. So a lot of times, grabbing onto that conspiracy is the path of least resistance, right? It's the easiest way to rationalize what's wrong with our society. The problem with that is if you're, and most conspiracies have an element of truth, right? That's how they get spread.
Right.
To latch on to. But when we latch onto that conspiracy, it stops us from digging deeper, and it stops us from actually addressing the foundational core problems that are causing us to be where we're at.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually, I think, a good way. The guy I mentioned in the previous slide, Peter Staudenmeier, gave a really great talk you could find on YouTube about conspiracies and how even there's leftist conspiracies. It's not just a right-wing thing. And he said that one good way to identify a conspiracy is, does the supposed theory, or whatever you would call it, address systemic issues? Because most conspiracies don't. Capitalism is a whole social structure and system that's very complicated, very hard to understand. And when it's hard to understand, it's easy to kind of fall back to, well, it's really just this one person or this one thing. And if we just change that one thing or that one person or whatever, that's the problem, and we'll fix it all. But that's not really addressing all of the systemic nature of this, how it's part of our economy, our society, our culture, and all of our interactions between each other. There's a lot that has to change here in order to really change this mindset and culture. And that's very similar to the Take America Back, return to normalcy sort of attitude. That's another myth that we see about capitalism, that what we're experiencing today is abnormal, that it's just something went wrong and we can fix it, and then we'll just be back to normal. That not only does rose-tinted glasses on history, but it again doesn't address all these systemic issues that the United States from the very beginning was designed as essentially a white supremacist capitalist project. So there was no point where we take America back or whatever. What we have to do is build something better. We have to do something different. And then finally, the final myth here is that even when folks will get to that point where they say, okay, we do have to do something different, capitalism is the problem, many folks through history have decided to kind of go it on their own and say, well, I'm going to go out into the woods in Vermont and I'm going to make a commune, and I'm going to live with my commune buddies, and we're going to topple capitalism. We're going to make an alternative. And those projects pretty much always fail because it's always a small group against the dominant culture of the world. We can't win against capitalism as a couple of people. We have to win as a social movement, a global social movement, a mass working class movement, various ways to describe it. That's the only way that we're going to win against this. All right. I wanted to throw in one little quick slide here about capitalism, because I think we're seeing a lot of this right now. As capitalism begins to fail, as babies don't get their baby formula, as we're wondering whether or not there's insulin and things like that, people are losing their faith, whatever faith they might have had in the political system that exists today and in capitalism. And so folks are struggling, trying to understand the complexity of capitalism, and that's really hard. Especially if you haven't been taught, a lot of leftist socialist history and things like that. And then you're struggling. So you're looking for answers right now. And this is the time when things can get scary, because what happens when capitalism starts to fail is if we don't have an alternative that is fighting for freedom and liberation and democracy for everyone, it can very easily turn into fascism. So I wanted to kind of quote here from a report from about 100 years ago. Clara Zetkin, who wrote an essay, The Struggle Against Fascism, in the Weimar Republic era Germany, and so saw this firsthand. She said, fascism is an expression of the decay and disintegration of the capitalist economy and a symptom of the state's dissolution. So essentially people losing faith in politics. And what will end up happening is if we don't understand a socialist alternative to capitalism, people will fall for those conspiracies, and they'll fall into conspiracies that look to blame somebody. So they'll blame racism, xenophobia, foreigners outside of your country, outside of your nation, transphobia, anti-Semitism. All of these things will play into the conspiracy, and it'll be about attacking them to get back to normal, right? So it's very important that we understand how capitalism plays into the development of fascism if we're not building a leftist movement.
And it's, that point is perfectly illustrated in the tactics of the Republican Party, right? That they are amazing at weaponizing identity and differences to rile up their base. And the reality is, because the Democratic Party and for the most part leftist organizations have abandoned rural America, have abandoned everywhere but the cities, when rural folks are seeing their farms close, their food get more expensive, they don't have access to quality health care. When all of that happens, the only alternative the only reasoning that they're being presented with in most cases is one of blame and division and hate that's being pushed by the Republican Party, and they've been incredibly successful at it. It's not just an idea from 100 years ago. I couldn't find it, but Rudolf Rocker in Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice kind of has the same kind of discussion about how capitalism and fascism are one and one. That fascism is the full merger of capitalism, basically the end goal of it. So
I had the book. I was reading it recently, which is why I thought to add it in here. So the last point I want to make before we move to our next section is that Zetkin had advocated this report. The Struggle Against Fascism was given to the International Communist Conference that was going on at the time as a very important thing that leftists wanted to know about. How do we deal with fascism? How do we address it? And she pointed out that the way to fight it is through politics and through our ideals, setting our good vision of what the alternative should be. Instead of blaming others, that we build something better together. Because fascism takes advantage of anti-capitalist talk to blame others. We have to take an anti-capitalist talk to say, no, we can do better than this. We can have a better society that works for everybody. And then people don't go down that path, right? Then people will help you build something better. But in the absence of that is where fascism grows. So it's very important that we build a leftist movement to counter the politics and the ideology of this extreme right wing that comes from capitalism, or the failure of capitalism more specifically, which is I think basically what this slide says. So I think we already discussed it. I do like this quote though: the left does not have a monopoly on the critiques of capitalism, and given its present historical weakness, there's a great danger in the rise of reactionary forms of anti-capitalism. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that even some of the folks that are starting to speak out against capitalism right now, if they're not specifically pushing a leftist, eco-socialist, freedom and democracy for all sort of message, those anti-capitalist messages can actually end up supporting, fascism and the continuation of oppression and suppression and all these things. And unfortunately, as the second quote says, many of the progressive I always think progressive Democrats, they lack an explanation on why social democracy. Think of the New Deal. That was a big deal for the Democrats. They fail to have an explanation on why social democracy failed. It failed in this country. The New Deal and unions and things like that have been systematically dismantled in the US over the last number of decades and replaced by extreme neoliberalism, focus on market capitalism. And so why did it fail? Well, I think, like we talked about in our myths, it failed because it tried to dress up capitalism and say, well, we'll make some safety nets and things, but it never addressed the underlying problems that we talked about with the market imperatives and private property and exploitation of labor and all that. It never really addressed those issues. So of course it failed and got replaced by more ridiculous versions of capitalism. So that's why we need eco-socialism. Go ahead, Chris.
And because, the New Deal was essentially, a life raft for capitalism. It wasn't in any way really offering any kind of challenge to capitalism. What it did was put up, state-sponsored buttresses. So, as capitalism was failing, and the Great Depression was really showing the failures of capitalism, the New Deal came in, and while it did provide a lot of public jobs for a relatively short period of time, it didn't challenge private ownership, right? So it was only a matter of time, right? If you leave your enemy, intact, the pushback is going to happen, and it really took a generation, right? Once a generation passed, and a generation or two passed, and you don't remember how huge and how important the New Deal was, you stop defending it, right? And then Reagan can come in and really do some damage, But then you get to us, right? We're 80 years out from the Green New, or from the New Deal. And many of the core programs of the New Deal, millennials and Gen Z aren't convinced we're going to get to realize them, right? Social Security may be gone and defunct, and it was, that was one of the core central things. So it's been damaged to the point that future generations don't have the nostalgia that past ones did. And we don't have it because our whole lives it's been very apparent that we weren't going to be included in those those programs. Those programs were going to be funded by us and drained by the time it got to be our thing.
Yep. All right. So I guess since we're transitioning to a new section, were there any pressing questions, or I can't see, so I'm relying on you, Chris.
There's nothing in the chats.
Okay, well, folks, if you have any questions, go ahead and start throwing them in there, and we'll continue on, and we'll come back to them at our next section point. So we've talked a little bit about capitalism and why it doesn't work, and why social democracy and reformist type ideas also don't work, because they don't address the underlying issues with capitalism. So socialism is the idea that we are trying to address those underlying concerns. So what exactly does that look like? You could define socialism in many different ways, and of course there are many different ways. So we're just going to try to hit kind of the big picture here, and then we can go more into it. A lot of socialist thought started originally in the workplace, in the economy, that, as we had mentioned in the very beginning slide, capitalism kind of came out of the transition from the more feudal agrarian sort of era into this industrial economy type of era. And so when that happened and people, moved from rural farms to the city to work wages in workplaces, that was essentially a very new thing in history. So we've been kind of struggling with that concept ever since. So socialism kind of started there, saying, well, part of the problem is that we go work in our workplaces, we go work in industry and things, and we don't have any say-so over our working conditions, what we're producing, what we're going to do with what we're producing. Is it really the thing our community even needs? None of those questions are addressed. So one way you could think of socialism is workplace democracy. We're asking for the workers to be able to make those decisions together in a democratic way, to own the means of production, take ownership of what they're producing in their workplace and why they're producing it and what their working conditions are and all those things. So that's one way to look at it. But you could expand it beyond a single workplace into looking at the economy as a whole. That when we talk about a socialist economy, we're talking about a more democratic form of managing the economy as a whole than just throwing everything in the market and letting CEOs throw money at each other. We want to include everyone in decision making of the economy, because let's face it, the economic decisions impact everybody. And that's even beyond workplaces. We can talk about it having democracy in one workplace, but let's say if that workplace is doing some kind of industry that might end up with toxic runoff or pollution or something like that, that runoff might end up in a stream or a watershed or something that goes down and affects other communities. And so now you have this question of, okay, that workplace was democratic, but the effects of their decisions are affecting this other community down here. So we want to create an economic system that actually includes everyone, that includes not just all the workers, but all of the people of the community and all of the surrounding communities to get together to make these big economic decisions, that's best for what the people of that community and region all actually want and need. And a lot of that is placed under direct community control, instead of having the private property where some capitalist claims exclusive ownership over it. We instead say some of those resources, and they could be natural resources, but they could also be the factories and all themselves, right? The means of production. We call that the commons, and it's owned by everybody and managed by everybody in the community. A third way, I think, to think about it that doesn't get talked about enough is also just in the sense of democracy itself, that when we're making decisions that could impact others, how do we make a decision and include them? What do we mean by an inclusive decision-making process? And what happens when two people in that process strongly disagree with each other? They have some kind of conflict here. We need a way to resolve that conflict in a fair way that's taking everyone's opinions, but also their human rights and things into account. And that's something that's, again, glossed over by the capitalist market system. It's whoever has the most money, they get to buy the thing and put the thing there. And it doesn't matter if you get dirty air or dirty water or, terrible working conditions or whatever it is. The person that owns it said that that's what they want. We don't want to do that, right? We want to have this inclusive, grassroots, democratic, participatory structure where everyone is included in those important decisions. So, you have any thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, on that last point, it's also, this is where actually having democracy comes into play, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like every few years people realize that America is not a democracy, that we're an oligarchy,
right?
And it gets declared high, from the mountaintops by people. But the reality is, the U.S. was founded by oligarchs for oligarchs, right? This was the plan the entire time around. I once had someone tell me that, the founding fathers weren't wealthy to the point of the 1%. And I went and I looked and I broke it down, and that's actually false. Something like 3 out of the top 5 richest presidents were from that original era. The people who signed the Declaration of Independence were the oligarchs, and they wrote a constitution and founded a country that was made to serve them, not the common man. So that's why it's really important. And if you look, you apply that into modern current events. You look at something like Medicare for all, where over 90% of Democrats support it, over 50% of Republicans, over 60% of all citizens support Medicare for all, but it can't even get a vote because we don't have democratic representation, right? And we can talk about direct democracy versus representative democracy. Those are theoretical conversations we can have, but when we're talking about 300 million people, there's probably going to be some kind of representation, right? It's just how many people have been in an organizational meeting and 10 people can't have a civil conversation, let alone 300 million. So, direct democracy is not only a systemic change, but a cultural change has to take place, that people show up to community meetings and people, are actively civically engaged and things like that we can move towards. But even within it, looking at our current system, the representative democracy that we have is showing it's, consistently shooting down publicly popular ideas, right? The number of people that a strict abortion restriction is very small. Most people want some restrictions, but we're about to let 9 people remove access to essential medical care, or potentially, right? Because they're going to pass it off to the states. And in the case of the Senate, we're going to let 1 or 2 people say we're not going to defend this, right? Manchin gets to say no, and when Manchin says no, it's over, right? One person really got to decide that we're not going to, protect the right of reproductive freedom legislatively. And this has been a failure of the Democrats for a long time. They've had many opportunities where they controlled both parties or both houses of Congress and the presidency, and they could have passed it. Obama openly said that protecting it legislatively was not a priority for him. Mm-hmm. And now look where we're at, right? The Supreme Court swung under Trump, and we're on the brink of losing it. It's a very hard, at times to kind of understand what this different kind of system looks like. When you're talking about community management, education and healthcare always come to mind. But it can even talking about, my city budget. In my city budget, the Public Works Department and the Police Department ask for the same amount of money in their budget request. The Police Department got 99%, and the Public Works Department got 30%. Right? So in my town, I tell people, if you think the roads suck, blame the cops, because that's where the money went. And that's how our top-down, management system works. You're told you have this much money to spend, go, right? And that goes with education dollars and healthcare dollars and all that kind of stuff. And when you start community managing it, the whole thing flips, right? The whole dynamic of power flips, because what happens under community control is your local, health board, which is elected from providers, and the doctors are elected, but also the community is elected, and they say we didn't need this much, and the tax rates and things like that, and the revenue, raising tools are set to get that much money, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're setting our goals based on need and not profit. Whereas what we have right now is they're basically it gets dropped down. Look at education, right? We just underfunded until we can privatize it. And that's both parties who are engaged in that. So when you get this top-down, profit motives just keep pushing, the amount of resources available down and down and down, and then they get split, into smaller and smaller bits to get to everyone. When we flip that and we have community control instead of, top-down control, we're able to say, this is what we need, and then plan the economy, plan the taxes, plan revenue outlets to achieve that goal and make sure that we're fulfilling the needs, regardless of the profits.
Yeah, exactly. So, when we say democracy on this slide, we're not talking about the propagandized version of democracy that the red and blue parties talk about, where every 4 years you get to vote for one of their oligarchs. We're talking about an actual form of grassroots democracy where you have more direct say in how things are decided. It's not decided top down, it's decided bottom up, in a different sort of way. And it's a focus on the questions we asked at the very beginning. What do we want out of life? What do we want? How do we want to live? We want to make those decisions first and then set the economy and all to go along with that, instead of the opposite, where, they set things top down to drive more profits, and that's it. So it's a very big shift in culture and mindset, not just, institutions and all. I have a couple of quotes to kind of illustrate what socialism means. I like this one from Eugene Debs. Socialism is the theory of society in which the workers are to own the social means of production. and in which the workers will use them not to produce multimillionaires. Well, today we would say billionaires, I'm sure, but not to fill the land with wealth. Wait, no, I'm sorry. To fill the land with wealth, not billionaires. But so the land, so the people have the wealth so that poverty such as we know it today is abolished. And that's an important thing, right? That's setting our goal. We want to live in a society that does not have poverty, right? That's an important goal that you don't hear under capitalism. They'll tell you, well, we can reduce it if we set 2%. No. We're abolishing poverty. We're very specific about what we want.
Or they declare war on it. The most American policy on poverty, the war on poverty.
Right. So from the IWW, which is one of the early unions, still exists. They're a syndicalist union. They have this quote here about class struggle, which is even more forceful than the way Eugene Debs put it. That the working class and the employing class, so the workers versus the people with money and power, have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among the millions of the working people. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the working class takes possession of the means of production, abolishes the wage system, and lives in harmony with the earth. By organizing industrially, we are forming the structure of a new society within the shell of the old, which is a pretty big radical quote that you might have even heard other places. But this one really sets the tone that it's not just abolishing poverty, but it's abolishing the wage system, which, as we were saying earlier, this whole wage system idea is keeps people controlled by the people that own private property, right? They say, I exclusively make decisions and all, and I'll pay you a wage, which is not what you're worth because I keep the profits, ha ha ha. So that's what they're talking about here. We want to abolish that kind of society. We want to create a society where when we all work together, our communities are benefiting from that work. We're producing the things we need, not just for the profits of a few. And we're doing it in harmony with the earth. I like that this quote also acknowledges that. It has to be in tune with nature, within the limits of nature and things, and not that grow or die infinite growth imperative that you see under capitalism.
Yeah, and I think this quote really drives home the shift in the union movement, especially in the United States, where most of our major, I call them nowadays corporate or collaborationist unions, right? Because in many ways, a lot of our unions have become collaborationists, right? They work with the capital to provide appeasement, but they've forgotten this. They've lost touch with this core thing that the union is the place where workers wage battle against capital. And it's really gotten sucked down into medical benefits and cost of living adjustments.
Right.
And this is kind of what we talked about at the beginning, right? We were talking about you have to stay true, and you have to constantly go back and refresh yourself with the values that you're putting forth, the values that you're fighting for. Because if you don't, you forget that there can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people. And instead, you put all of your resources into making sure your your finite membership, your limited membership gets their cost of living adjustment. Personal recent story. I was recently at my in-laws picking up my son, and my brother-in-law stopped me and said, "Help me form a union." And he works at a sandwich shop. And so I reached out to a union organizer friend that used to be the president of our local trades and labor council, and I said, "Hey Jim, who's doing work in the service industry? What union in town can help him unionize his workplace?" And the response was no one. And I live in a state capital. Every single major union has offices in my town, but those offices aren't here to help the working people of my town. They're here to lobby the legislature, right? That's why they exist here. And so in a town of 120,000 people, none of the modern labor organizations are doing any work in trying to organize the service industry where our most oppressed live. And so it's important to kind of, it's why we have to go back, right? I was in class years ago and someone listed unions as a defining property of socialism. And I pushed back and I said, what you're talking about are unions are a property of capitalism, or a moderation of capitalism. If we got rid of capitalism, we wouldn't have the institutions that we call unions anymore. There would still be worker organizations, but they would function in a radically different way that we could all, it's kind of like talking about community control of the police, right? The public safety apparatus that's being talked about in community control of the police is such a radically different, in radical forms of community control at least.
Mm-hmm.
So radically different from policing, then we probably shouldn't call it policing anymore, right? They shouldn't be policed anymore. They're doing something different in a public safety mindset instead of an authoritarian policing mindset. So, and then the same goes for unions, right? What we think of as unions are a response directly to capitalism. They aren't an expression of socialism. Especially the modern major unions are incredibly anti-democratic. So it's just it's always refreshing to, and the IWW is still around, right? You can be wobbly, you can pay your dues, and one of the great things about the IWW, if you're like my brother-in-law and don't have any institutional support and want to unionize, you can run an independent NLRB election through the IWW, right? You sign up for them. You don't get as much, support. They don't have the resources to send an organizer to you, like an SEIU type union might. But if you're like me here in a state capital in the Midwest and have zero support going on, the IWW still exists with this radical outtake, this radical perspective, and they can help you.
Yeah, exactly. That's an important distinction that many of the old, the unions that won the 40-hour work week and all that stuff were these radical unions that were fighting against capitalism itself. They declared capitalism itself to be the enemy. and when they won things like that, they didn't see that as the end goal. They saw that as, that's a one stop on the way toward abolishing capitalism. And unfortunately, many of the unions have been co-opted into the Democratic Party, into today's capitalist ruling structure, to where now they manage capital more than they fight capital.
Yeah.
So it's an important distinction. I think when we talk about a socialist society, yes, unions are important, but it has to be this radical union that is really committed to the broader struggle. So, real quick, we can kind of talk about the basis of some socialist thought. As I kind of mentioned earlier, socialism kind of came about from, in a sense, since the very beginning, because as the old, at least in Europe, as the old feudal mercantile era ended and transitioned into this more industrial economy, people moved out of the rural areas into cities. That created an explosion in economic growth and scientific growth, philosophical growth, but also all of these new social problems that hadn't existed before, because we didn't have wage jobs like we do today. These were all like new things that were occurring. So, these early philosophers and thinkers were starting to grapple with these ideas, these early socialist relations. So you had, philosophers like Kant in Germany, who talked about epistemology and like how you structure your thoughts, essentially, how you structure your knowledge in a way to better understand what's going on, which was kind of refined by, Hegel and Feuerbach. Excuse my German. And that got refined into, they talked about things like ethics, what modern ethics, especially around, the industrial economy and things like that. They talked about logic, how to think very clearly about ideas. And that led to dialectical thinking, which is, in a summary, how you deal with contradictions, because as society changed from rural to city, from agriculture to industrial and all of these contradictions kind of came up in society. And so there was a question of like, how do we deal with what seems to be a contradiction, right? In the way that things play off or against each other. And how can we think about it, and how can we use that to try to produce a better system and rethink our socialist social relations? So I know Chris is big on this stuff, so I'm going to hand it to Chris if you want to say stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Kant and Hegel, Kant and Hegel in particular, Feuerbach as well, but they really focused on ideas, right? How do we think about things? How do we speak about things? How do we put ideas out there? In many ways, I see modern, Democrats taking on a lot of their characteristics, where they think that if we just make the right argument to Republicans, to fascists, then they'll be convinced.
Right.
And Kant and Hegel especially were really convinced, and Marx grew up a young Hegelian, meeting in in coffee shops and debating ideas, and the idea that the person that won the debate was right, and therefore their opinion should be validated. But the reality of the actual world doesn't quite show that through. And then dialectics, to me, dialectics is a kind of a map of how society progresses.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you like Garrett said, you've got competing ideas, and something will come out of them. And it's very rarely that one wins absolutely over the other. Mm-hmm. It's often a mixture of things that comes out, a new thing that comes out of the old. And you get into then Marx, which I think we'll probably hit on the next slide.
Yep.
Takes dialectics in a whole different direction, as do fellow Marxists.
Yeah, so might as well move on to that.
It kind of makes sense, right? That with this new capitalist economy emerging, with this new capitalist system emerging, people had to think about it, right? They had to wrap their minds around it. The world was changing. The transition from feudalism to capitalism was very drastic, and as such, people had to take a moment to think about it, to figure it out, to start laying the foundations for people who came. People like Marx, who came, and Proudhon, who thought Marx was even still too stuck in ideas, but people who came later to say we've got this foundation of ideas, but ideas don't change the world, action does, right? And take a more materialistic rather than idealistic. And that's not materialism like we use it in modern sense, right? Materialism in the modern American vernacular is someone who likes to have a lot of things. When we talk about materialism, under Marx and Marxism, what we're talking about is addressing things as they exist in the real world, in the material world, not as they exist in the ideal world or in our minds.
Yeah, exactly. So so Karl Marx is a big figure in socialist history, obviously, because of taking these philosophical concepts and kind of pulling it into not just analyzing society generally, but analyzing the economy and economic relations, and that eventually led to his work on books such as eventually Capital, which was of course about capitalism, and essentially predicted that because of all of the problems and contradictions of capitalism and the grow or die imperative and exploitation of workers and things like that, that capitalism essentially is eventually doomed. There's no way that it can continue. It's more of a question of when does capitalism fail and under what conditions, and what happens, right? So it kind of predicted the rise of workers and socialism. And that's been kind of the debate since then about exactly what does that look like and how do you organize it and all these things, right? So, but this was kind of the beginning of talking about the problems of capitalism from this Hegelian sort of philosophical framework of really understanding the details of capitalism, not just as an economic structure but a social structure, and wrestling with all of those ideas. And of course, because you're wrestling with all these ideas, Marx himself over his lifespan would revisit the subject and come back, and as events happened in history, would kind of revise some of his stuff and rethink things. And so it ended up being that a lot of Marx's work is even somewhat contradictory with himself, depending on what time you're looking at, right? Because a lot of these questions are still not fully answered. We still don't really have, the full answers on what to do with capitalism. And so because of that, we've seen kind of all these tendencies break off that take a lot of important analysis from Marxism, but kind of take it in different directions based on, successes and failures in history, and wrestling with these important questions and contradictions.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that's really important for people to understand about Marxism is that it didn't start and it didn't end with Karl Marx.
Right.
It's a process. It's a lot of Marxists really do talk about it as a scientific-based theory, a way to. It's not a it's not a prophetic guidebook that tells us the answer to every question. It's a methodology through which we can do our work and find said solutions. So if you're going to talk about Marxism, you can't talk about it without talking about Kant and Hegel and Feuerbach, who laid the foundation. And another reason, that Marx kind of changed, in my opinion, that he changed some positions and that he was kind of fluid and shifting, is that, one, that's just the nature of thought,
right.
Things out. But two, Marx was existing in a time of developing capitalism, of rising capitalism. Marx existed in a time where not only did every European nation state had a distinct culture and identity, but where he came from in Germany, each state had their own distinct culture and identity, right? You were from the Hamburg state, or you were Prussian, and those things meant something. And so the world that Marx was living in, even to his death, was still kind of a proto-capitalism. It was still, it hadn't developed into what we know today, which is this total capitalism, right? And that might be the good way to think about it, where, in Marx's day, there was still a distinctly Prussian culture. There was still a distinctly Germanic culture. There was still a distinctly European culture. What we see in the modern world, there is a little bit of culture and language and things like that do exist. But capitalism has permeated every aspect: economic, social, political, to the point that capitalism is the global driving force, not the nation state, right? It's flipped.
Yeah.
And because of that, the people that followed Marx took it in different directions. And my favorite kind of progression, right, shows Marx, who hadn't seen this full merging of culture yet. It hadn't really started to happen. Or if it was, what was happening with the totality of capitalism rising, was just kind of in its early days when Marx was alive. But by the 1920s, for example, Gramsci in Italy saw it very clearly, and was able to put out new ideas about hegemony, about the idea of how a cultural idea or how a piece of the culture becomes widespread. How does capitalism become a major, the major driving force in all of Europe, right, in all of the West? And Gramsci gave us that. Gramsci took the dialectic, and he talked a lot about the war of maneuver versus the war of position, right? And the idea that you have to be able to, as you make gains, hold your ground. That's both materially and idealistically, right? You've got to be able to hold that ground. So all of a sudden, Marx provided this foundation, but Gramsci in his time was able to see, the really early clarity of, oh, this totality of capitalism is coming. And then from there, you run into people like Adorno and Horkheimer, who in the 40s and 50s are talking about the culture industry, and how culture has become an industrial thing, right? We've managed to commoditize and market incentivize and market produce culture. And you just have to look at Hollywood to see that in its modern incarnation, or professional sports and the millions of dollars they're paid by the military to be patriotic. And then you get someone like Guy Debord, who comes out in the 60s and is talking about the society of the spectacle, and how the culture industry has produced a myth of capitalism that is bought and accepted by the masses as the truth, when it's really not, right? We kind of exist in this bauble, in this smoke screen. And so, that's just looking at culture, right? Where there's a clear Marxist progression that started before Marx and continued after, as they dealt with this grappling with how, capitalism was able to integrate itself with everything. And you can look at the same things with, Julia Kristeva comes in and takes Freud and Marx and combines them, and comes up with ideas like psychic revolution, the idea that you have to have an internal revolution before you can actually revolt against capitalism. Or people like Angela Davis start bringing in race, right? And so Marxism, post-Marx, for better, or in many ways for better, and in some ways for worse, becomes very intersectional, right? And identity and culture are pulled more and more into this kind of material process, the way of thinking that is brought about by Marxism. So it's, and this is one of those things, like, we could spend days, right, going to bookshelves and pulling things out, and like this Mark, and then you get into like postmodernism with people like Foucault and things like that, Lyotard and things like that. So it really is this long lineage of thought that continues today. And so people really need to understand that if you want to, understand Marxism, you don't just read Karl Marx. You start before and you read after too.
Yeah, exactly. I moved to the next slide here about the different schools or tendencies, or whatever you will call it, of socialist thought, because there is kind of a progression here that's interesting. That it goes from those early philosophers inspired, who became known as the early utopian socialists. I was just thinking of their names, and it'll come to me in a moment. But the very early ideas at the very beginning of kind of the industrial era, you had some early Fourier and Owen, and those folks. They at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you already had some folks thinking, the way that this is oppressing workers and treating workers doesn't seem right. How can we do better? How can we create a better society? And Owen, for example, I think was a factory owner, but recognized this, and so tried to set up his factory in a way that the workers actually democratically made decisions in the factory and things like that. So you kind of had these early experiments where folks were trying to get workers to have more say in things, and just kind of plan out better socialist societies. And so that's where the word utopian comes from. And in today's language, I think folks would use it as a negative. It wasn't really meant negative back in the day. It was just meant more for, how do we create a better society? How do we create a good society? I think it's Greek roots, right? Utopia. It's literally good city or good society or something like that.
Yeah, so, I mean, Engels came from a factory owning family.
Yeah, right. So those were your early socialists, and Marxism. Karl Marx, I think, did a really was kind of a big turning point of taking the philosophical aspects and really making the solid analysis that folks could study and then grow, right, based on new information and stuff that Chris was talking about as time went on, because capitalism itself has been evolving during this whole time period. It's absolutely true that the form of capitalism that existed in the 1700s, 1800s, it's very different from what we have today. Today, you could call neoliberalism, because in the 1700s and 1800s, they called that liberalism. You were a liberal if you supported markets and things in the 1700s. And we have like this new global form of markets control of the global economy. And so that's why it has a new name, right? Neoliberalism.
If you want to piss off a Republican, tell them they're a member of a liberal party.
Right.
Because they
Founders
are.
were liberals, yeah.
The United States was founded as a classically liberal democracy.
Yep.
Basically meaning capitalism, but with some regulations and some reins.
Right.
And the variation of those, what the reins are, is there, but both the Republican and Democratic parties were, founded as classically liberal parties. And it really makes it's a whole problem we have in the United States with people not knowing what the words they use, mean. In a theory and traditional sense, it's like libertarians in the United States are a far right wing, ideology. But the coiner of the term libertarian was someone mentioned here in a contemporary of Marx, Proudhon.
Right.
Right. He was one of the first people to use the word libertarian. He identified himself as libertarian. He was a contemporary of Marx, the communist, and Bakunin, the anarchist. And he wrote an essay called "What is Property?" and his answer was theft.
Yes.
Right. But so traditionally, libertarianism is a bottom left ideology, kind of analogous to anarchism, right? And I'm sure Bakunin and Proudhon could spend hours arguing why I'm wrong, and they're not actually similar. But looking at it from our perspective today, they're both bottom left ideologies, very similar. And what happened in America was they took the anti-state portion of libertarianism, and they left out the anti-capitalist portion of libertarianism. So if you go to the rest of the world, if you go to Europe, libertarians aren't right wingers. They're bottom lefters.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So, we've had this interesting progression here. We went from the early utopian socialists to Marxists that tried to put it on a much more, scientific, philosophical basis, their analysis of capitalism.
And broad. In a broad basis.
Yeah, broad basis.
Right. The utopian socialist was, Owens trying to restructure his factory. And there was a goal of that creates a model that then can be copied, whether by the goodness of factory owners' hearts or through a Marxist type, worker uprising. But they kind of started small scale, and when Marxists, started trying to, form their internationals and do their work, they understood, because they were Marxists, right, that it had to be global. That it couldn't be a bubble that existed surrounded by a hostile capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So that led to the systematizing, right, of socialist ideas, and various socialist groups started communicating and sharing ideas and getting together, and that led to the First International, where you had the First International Meeting of Working Men, I think is its official name. Yeah. And all the socialists of different varieties got together, and that's its own whole interesting thing, because it was its own like meltdown fight with each other. But you had several different groups at that, where you had Marxists, you had Proudhon, who I think called his sect, or whatever you call it, mutualism, which was sort of a market based but socialist worker controlled thing. That's its own interesting idea. And then you had Bakunin, who was the anarchist, and the Marxists and the anarchists in particular had like a really big battle with each other, because there was a lot of agreement on what the goals of socialism were, but there was a lot of disagreement on how to get there. So, many of the Marxists supported forming, workers' parties, labor's parties to enter electoralism. Some wanted more outside of the electoral system to form parties and like more union based things, right? And the anarchists were completely swore off any sort of elections and electoralism. It was completely about building bottom up community through like mutual aid and things like that. So there was a big argument, and they yelled at each other, and Bakunin and the anarchists left. And so, unfortunately, that divide still exists today, where you'll find folks on one side that don't like the other because they only read that one group's writings. But in reality, what happened there is that the Marxists and the anarchists both had really good points. And so when you get to the post-Marxists, when you get to more modern era socialists, you've seen that dialectic come back in, where the contradictions between these important questions that the Marxists and anarchists brought up, they're starting to be thought about and combined or merged into something new. We're developing newer things out of those important points. Also in relation to how capitalism exists today as opposed to it did back then. So you see post-Marxists, and then eventually the green socialists. We have various forms of ecosocialism, and then Bookchin's social ecology that we'll come to in a moment. So you can kind of see this progression of ideas here, where socialism, because there's still a lot of unanswered questions, there's a lot of different types of socialism. But I think our goal is not necessarily to say one is better than the other or something, but to learn from all of these things through history. They all have successes and failures that we can learn from, and we can pull together to try to do better in the future.
Yeah, I think that's the really key thing, right? That Michael, I think it was Michael. Yeah, Michael Shin on the Zoom had asked, comments about attempts at socialist projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of in here. You've got the Marxist-Leninists and things like that. But the reality is, none of those projects have succeeded to the point that capitalism is a threat. Right? And like it or not, overcoming the pushback of capitalism is a key part of the success, right? So we've got to be able to not look to create exact replicas of what was done in the past. We've got to be able to learn lessons, right? And things that worked and for the Bolsheviks might work for us, or they might not, because we're dealing with a completely different type of system. And that was something that Marx was very, very adamant about. That how the worker revolution, how capitalism manifests itself, how socialism comes in response, is a very local and a very unique expression in every different place, in every time, in every era, in every location. So how Garrett experiences capitalism where he lives outside Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and how I experience it, like where Garrett lives in Pittsburgh, manufacturing used to be big. Now, I don't know, I've imagined it's died quite a bit, but it's like that used to be, mining and steel country.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas where I come from in some downstate central Illinois, it's all about agriculture. We've got some of the best soil in the world, and we're destroying it with monocrops, right? So how these things manifest is very unique, and that's something that Marx said very, very pointedly. That the way that we go undertake these struggles depends on the material conditions upon which we're working with. So we can learn a lot from the past. We can really take some of the values, right? And I think one thing that's really important for socialists is a level of what's called critical support. Right? Venezuela, Cuba, for example, have made amazing strides in addressing poverty, right? And if you go back to the earlier into the presentation, we had quotes talking about how the ending of poverty is a core value of socialism, right? So when we look at that, we have to be able to look at these projects and say, Venezuela has built millions and millions of social housing projects. They've housed their people. Literacy is in both projects is skyrocketed. Healthcare quality in Cuba is, amazing in many cases, despite their isolation. So there's been solid gains, but at the same time, we've got to be able to have real conversations about the flaws. Venezuela's project is propped up by gasoline, by oil. They fund all of these things by selling oil, and just thus being, they're a petro state. That's what they are. And they are trying to diversify off, right? But we need to be able to have these conversations where we talk about shortcomings, and we talk about other alternative ways that we can fight for socialism without writing the whole project off. Right? We live in a system. Garrett and I are both bottom lefters, right? I don't think either one of us trust the state. And in all of these cases, we have a state. The state is often used to do not, to oppress and things like that. So we've got, when it comes to these other projects, we've got to provide some critical support, right? We can't just give in to the capitalist idea that the communism in the Soviet Union, which wasn't communism even by their own, admission, caused 100 million deaths, right? That good old stat. We can't accept that as truth because it's propaganda, right? People died all over the world through those things, through that period that they're crediting 100 million, and capitalism killed way more if we're just calling every death in every capitalist state, a death of capitalism. So we've got to be able to have this critical support where we can push back and defend these projects despite their imperfections, but still be able to have conversations about their imperfections and about how we can move forward and about how we can learn from them.
Yeah, and I think that gets into the next slide here, actually, which is, what sort of questions are there about what form the socialist struggle should take? And that's ultimately what all these different groups are trying to answer. They're trying to figure out what are the answers to these questions, because various things have been tried at various points in history. And, we haven't gotten rid of global capitalism yet, so nobody has been 100% successful. But there have been wins, there have been successes, but there's also been failures. And so, what can we learn from all these things? And three big points of difference, which I would call the kind of three key questions to ask about what our socialist struggle should take, come from this one essay, The Utopian Impulse by Dan Chodorkov. One of them is class analysis. So, all socialists recognize this kind of class structure of the wealthy over the working class. But there's kind of disagreement on exactly what that looks like. There's different layers to it that are complicated by various other factors, including, racism and sexism and various things. In the US, when you hear Bernie Sanders talk, for example, even when he talks about the wealthy and the top 1%, he still talks about the middle class. And, well, okay, the middle class, but what about the bottom? What about the working class? And so, there's all these structures to the class struggle that we have to consider. And we have to consider, who we're reaching out to and with what message, if we're trying to build a socialist society that works for everyone. Because we have to recognize that some folks benefit from this society, and they're not going to be the ones that are going to join our struggle, or at least not at the beginning, because they benefit from this.
And as we organize, our own socialist projects, it's important to look around the room and say, who are we?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the victories of socialism, the 40-hour work week, worker protections, all these kind of things that happen, those came from working class movements for the most part. Sure, there were intellectuals and theorists who were writing newspaper articles and things like that, were putting out ideas, but they were working class movements, based within the worker, within the lowest of the low of the workers in many cases.
Yeah.
But when you look at socialist movements post Red Scare, what we often see are an intellectual class making up most of the movement, right? Socialist movements, and I will say it's moving away from this, right? The trend and the speed, the trend, and including in the Green Party, is moving away from a educated middle class base, and then a big part of that is that we got the appeasement of the New Deal, and it gave people a little bit more of a buffer, a little bit more, some people, because it should be noted that in many of these programs that came out during the New Deal or post New Deal, they were very racially segregated. How the money was allocated often left out working class communities in favor of the burgeoning middle class communities and the growing suburbs and things like that. But in that post purge, post war period, much of socialism was an academic, somewhat comfortable base, and it's not surprising that such a base did not necessarily lead to a growth in the movement. It may have led to a growth of ideas. It may have led to a growth in theory and strategy, but when it came to actual wins and actual material gains, that's a period where we see the left continuing to shrink. And I think when we look at, luckily, thankfully, in recent years, last decade maybe or so, we're seeing and that this coincides with the rise of neoliberalism. As neoliberalism has rose, we're seeing more and more of the working class becoming engaged in socialist projects and socialist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you had mentioned that it looks different in different parts of the country, and in the highly industrialized Pittsburgh area, used to be highly industrialized with steel and coal and things like that. You see an interesting change here where, when you talk about this class analysis, the U.S. has largely shifted from a very industrial manufacturing based economy to now there's a lot of service jobs. And so you end up with this interesting dynamic here where when folks talk about unions, for example, and getting the working class, the existing unions for the steel industry and things like that have actually shifted to very conservative standpoints. Because they're about protecting their industry jobs that have the benefit of a union that has existed for a long time. So they make, relatively good wages with good healthcare and all this stuff, and they don't want to lose it. Versus the service workers, restaurant workers and things that are still making tipped wages, and they don't have unions to advocate for them. So I think, there's an important aspect to this analysis that needs to inform how we organize ourselves.
And many of our modern unions that still exist today are representing exploitative industries in terms of the the environment. It's why you see the AFL-CIO constantly backing pipelines, right? Because they prioritize a small number of construction jobs for their union members over the future of the planet. Right, that's a conscious decision that the AFL-CIO consistently makes, and that then ties into what Garrett said earlier when we were talking about unions and they're kind of attaching themselves to the Democratic Party, right? A few years ago, I was helping organize some Dakota Access Pipeline rallies and events, and one of them we were marching we had our rally and then we marched to different places that supported the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, I put the AFL-CIO on the list, and the liberals in the group threw a fit. They did not want to protest. They did not want to protest the AFL-CIO. The same thing happened when the climate strike protests were happening a few years ago. I got contacted by some people about helping put on a climate strike in our town, and they were Democrats, so I was talking to them. We said at the very beginning we need to be honest about where our lines are and supporting things, and so they said we should have our Democratic governor J.B. Pritzker speak, and I said, you crossed my line. And then they said, why? And I said, J.B. Pritzker is not only an investor, but a principal partner in Energy Transfer Solutions, who is behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? He's not just an investor; he's one of the largest investors in ever, period, when it comes to building that pipeline. I said his entire portfolio is oil and gas, and defense industry, and then Hyatt, which is what his family owns, right? His family owns a hotel chain, and he makes his money by exploiting workers. And so I said, this is crossing the line, right? He may speak good on the climate, but his investment portfolio says otherwise. And all of a sudden, I never got another call. I was just completely cut out of the planning, and it actually never happened, right? Because when it came down to it, they weren't willing to challenge the status quo.
Right. Yeah, I see a lot of this in Pittsburgh, where those old manufacturing jobs and steel and things like that, they've pivoted to do a lot of oil and gas work. And especially Pittsburgh and Allegheny County is a very Democratic run county and city. So all these unions are supporting all these Democratic politicians that are all for oil and gas and fracking and plastics, and they're trying to build a giant petrochemical facility not that far out of Pittsburgh that's going to completely destroy our water and air and drastically accelerate climate emissions. But that's being pushed for by the unions, by the Democratic Party, because they're propping up capitalism. And the reason they claim to support it is because of jobs, but it's like 100 jobs. They're going to destroy the planet, at a very minimum, destroy the county of over 1 million people, because like 100 people in oil and gas, like to have their job. Like we can restructure this way better and make sure everyone's taken care of. So I guess shouldn't dwell there too much more. But so let's see, socialist struggle. So there's a class analysis question. There's an organizational analysis, which is you could sort of talk about it as centralized versus decentralized. How much of a central structure you want versus how much of a decentralized structure you want, which is kind of an autonomy question, right? Like, do your small local groups, do they have more autonomy to make their own decisions and actions, or do you want everything coordinated by a central committee of some kind? And that's an important question, because there's been problems with both. You have to be very careful about how you're implementing things. And sort of related to that is the third question of the role of the state. A lot of folks that come from more of a Marxist perspective, there's this kind of a concept, a murky concept of like a transitional worker state. And that was a big sticking point with the anarchists, who said, if there's any kind of state, there's going to be a problem. We need to just shift directly to our socialist society. And, so that's a big question of how do you do that? And if you have to have a worker state, well, how do you do that? Because a lot of the worker states that have existed in history, the Soviet Union and things, have not actually worked out. And related to that is a question of, how does electoralism play into whatever other actions that we're doing? Some folks want to do electoralism, some completely swear it off. And, the question is, what is that role? How much should we do or not do? And, these are all somewhat open questions, because nobody completely has the answers yet. Although by trying to fuse together some of the most important analysis and critiques of, Marxists and anarchists, and looking at, real world revolutions and what happened, we could try to put together kind of a path forward to at least ideas that we should try next. And I think that's what informs a lot of green socialism, about where we should go next.
Yeah, and I've spent, let's see, I grew up with Republican parents, and at 11 I read Machiavelli's The Prince, and then I moved on to Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and then at 12 I picked up the Manifesto. And that at that point was when I started calling myself, a leftist and anti-capitalist. I actually didn't start using the word socialist until I joined the Green Party. Because when I was growing up young, socialists were right, the right wing, in terms of the left. It was like the right flank of the left, and that was largely because of people, things like the Socialist Party in France, that is basically gone now, and in all practical purposes, and it's gone because it moved liberal, right? It really was just a social democratic party that was using the word socialism. So when I was younger, I was an ANCOM. I was a bottom lefter. I was an anarcho-communist. But I've always considered myself a Marxist. And there's some really key reasons why. The dialectics, the process, the methodology is part of it. But for me, that transitional worker state is part of it. I don't see a way to do it without. What it looks like is a whole other story, but I often tell Greens, like, that's the role we need to be kind of trying to push ourselves into, right? We can have a violent revolution, or we can have fascism. Like, those are the things, that are on the table, and the middle road is a transitional state that the Green Party can attempt to insert itself as. And I'll say too, really day by day, year after year, I move further and further away from the idea that we just go straight to decentralized socialism, right? That we go straight to anarchism. And a big reason is the climate crisis. Maybe when these ideas were first coming, we had time to rearrange a million little communes that would move to work with each other and overcome the climate crisis. And there was certainly a time when that was something I would have seen as a viable tactic. But when I look at the world today, we've got 8 years, less than 8 years before we hit a no turning point at 2030 with levels. It's gonna take a centralized response. And then this is kind of the teetering thing between some of the tendencies that happens is like, how long is the transitional state?
Right.
That obviously there has to be an end, but at the same time, the changes that we're talking about aren't just policy; they're cultural, they're generational. So it's also likely not going to be a rapid transition, right? To completely retool the economy around an eco-socialist Green New Deal, like how we proposed, that was a 10-year proposal that required a strong central state to kind of not only push off the climate, not only push off the wrong word, not only to try to defend ourselves against, the coming climate catastrophe, but also to address issues of spiraling inequality and, white supremacy and racism and sexism and ableism and all the things, right? I'm not, especially on climate, the more time that goes by, the more I'm like, there's got to be a centralized solution, and then we come into that eternal debate of when does it dissolve, right?
Yep.
I'm a Marxist. I'm a very orthodox Marxist in this sense, where I believe that the transitional state is necessary, but I also believe that it should dissolve. That's a lot of top lefters, a lot of Leninists and MLMs, Marxist Leninist Maoists. They don't want the state to dissolve. They want state power to be the central mover. So it's a weird. The climate has done some weird things to my positions as time went on, and it became
but that's
more drastic. But
that's an important topic. It's an existential crisis, and so we have to think differently than we have in history. So, to kind of wrap up this discussion on socialism, we've talked about lots of possibilities and maybe where it needs to go and things. And so, at this point, especially looking at climate change and all, I'm sure a lot of folks start to ask, is it even possible? Can we even get there? Are we even going in the right direction? Is this even a thing? And I think there's a couple of answers to that. One, in the very beginning, our first slide, we talked about kind of the history that humanity has been around for, technically hundreds of thousands of years. Capitalism has existed for 500 years at most, right? And certainly not in the form that we're experiencing today. And so all of the things that we associate with human nature and human behavior today are really, folks' responses to living under an oppressive capitalist regime. They're not necessarily what I would call human nature in the sense of the way humans would act, if we lived in a better society that promoted the good of humanity as opposed to the worst of humanity. And we see this, and that's not just like a theoretical conversation. We see this actually from science, that folks that study evolution have pointed out. And Kropotkin has the book Mutual Aid: A Factor in Evolution, which is a good book to read on this, but he's not the only one that commented on it. That throughout not just human history, but even other species, throughout the existence of life on this planet, mutualism and cooperation, mutual aid, working together in social groups has always been a thing that evolution has favored. And certainly in humans, we're a very social species. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even when you feel negative about greed and corruption and things like that, that's stress responses to living under a capitalist society. That's not how people actually want to act if they had the time and the rest and weren't starving and things like that, right? and so capitalism, when you come down to it, it's new. It's not inevitable. It's not human nature. We can do something different because humans have, through most of history, lived differently. And by working together and organizing together, we can create a different type of society than capitalism. And that kind of leads into the second point here, that we should also think of socialism not as an end goal, that like we create a socialist society and we're done. It's actually an ongoing process, and it's probably like a forever ongoing process, because there will always be challenges that we face, and hopefully not as big and severe as climate change, but there will always be things that we have to adapt to, and there will always be goals. When we get back to that question about what do you want to do with your life, what does it mean to live, there will always be challenges that we want to face. And so society should always evolve with those, with our interests and our goals and the challenges that we face. So it's also important to think that socialism is not an end goal, but a process of always continually improving ourselves and improving society. So, we should always, regardless, be fighting for a better society. And whenever we could take a step forward, that in some sense is socialism. Whenever we take a step forward, even if it's not everything we wanted, just keep marching, keep trying to do better.
Yeah, this is another one of the areas where it's why I'm a Marxist. I don't believe in a peace, love, and happiness at the end of the tunnel. As long as there's two of us, we're going to have disagreements and we're going to work through them. In best case scenario, and we beat all of the odds and we survive, in a few billion years, we're going to have to figure out what to do when we don't have a home anymore. When the sun expands and either swallows us up or burns us up, we're going to have to evolve. And so, like Garrett said, the fight for socialism isn't something with a finite end point. But we live in a dynamic, in a dynamic world, in a dynamic environment, and dynamic ecosystems. And because of that the dynamic nature of our entire world and our entire existence, we have to be able to be constantly flexible. And we have to, and like we've talked about, right? At no point in this, workshop on socialism have we provided a blueprint. And because of that, we have to be able to weather, when we take that step forward, like Garrett says, sometimes a step back will come later, or sometimes our step forward will blow up in our face, right? Or an unforeseen consequence. One example of unforeseen consequences I always use is Obama's Cash for Clunkers program. I think that I think that the policy goal was admirable, to get more environmentally destructive vehicles off of the road. I don't think it was thought through about what that would do to car prices to the used car market, right? So we got some cars off the road, but we bricked them all, right? They weren't that we removed them from circulation, and that meant the price of buying a used car skyrocketed, and we're seeing the price of buying a car skyrocketing again now. But there was a huge jump in the used car market as a direct result of cash for clunkers, right? So it was a program with ecology as its one of its core things. Plus, they wanted to sell some more new cars. That was clearly part of it. But the environmental goals ended up having a negative economic impact for the working class.
Yeah. So when it comes to a socialist society, I think it's important to keep these things in mind, that it's not an end goal, it's a process, and it's always worth fighting. It's always worth fighting for a better life and a better society. And humans are not incapable of it. Well, it's if there is such a thing as human nature, socialism is more like our human nature. We like to cooperate and work together, even though there's disagreements sometimes, but people don't generally like to fight with each other. So kind of wrapping up with a quote here from Ursula Le Guin, who said, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then again, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And I think that's an important inspirational thing. There were kings and queens in feudal structure, and then there wasn't. And one day that'll be true of capitalism too. And it's up to us how we organize to change it and to decide what comes next. So I think it's already 10. So yeah. I feel like we probably have to skip this last little section, but don't want to keep folks on too long. But what I will say is that this last little section was mostly some kind of history of socialism in the US, but I think it actually fits better with organizing. So let me go to that slide here. Next month is our Organizing 101 live stream, where we talk, we talked about the Green Party first, we talked about socialism today. And so we want to take all the ideas from all that and talk about what does that mean for your personal organizing in your community and how you can be part of the green movement overall. So I think, some of these questions about learning from history kind of belong in that organizing talk. What can we learn from history about how to organize ourselves today? So there's definitely some great things to learn there from the socialist movements and the radical union movements in US history. Up to the founding of the Green Party itself, which was kind of an outgrowth of the fact that the old Socialist Party and old radical unions were beaten back by capitalism, and a lot of those early members and unions were essentially co-opted and pulled into the Democratic Party, and that's why you haven't really seen a strong left since the end of World War II. It's all been co-opted into the Democrats. So we can learn from that and the experience of the radical independent unions and parties before that point and how they won their struggles and what that means for us today.
And when you look at some of the projects, like some of the socialist projects in history, like the Soviet Union and China, a big thing when it came to the dawn of the birth of the Green Party. At the time that the Green Party was coming up in the late 70s and the 80s, a lot of the socialist energy, a lot of the socialist organizations had tied themselves to the Soviet Union or to China, who both had very progress and domination-based systems. They were modernizing and they were industrializing, and they were the environment was a resource with which to be exploited. And so where the Greens kind of started to differ was to say, no, we need to, and they weren't the first ones, obviously, to have these thoughts. These thoughts have been swirling through the socialist movement since its dawn. But it was, the green movement rose to say, um, no, we need to build a socialism that is, fits into ecological standards and ecological, abilities and things like that. And so that kind of difference at the time was a kind of a shift. We were trying, it was a shift of with people like Bookchin and Howie,
Mhm.
pushing for a different kind of socialism than what we had seen in practice. And socialism at that point that we had seen in practice, and even today when we, like we talked about Venezuela and it being a petro state, they aren't that the progress is often at the expense of the environment. So
Yeah. So think leave it there. Were there any questions that weren't answered? Or
So Michael Shinnon also want to ask summaries of different socialisms in other parties, like CPUSA, SPUSA, Socialist Alternative, PSL, Revolutionary Communist Party, Socialist Workers Party. So a lot of them came out of the old Socialist Party, right? Socialist Party USA, PSL, Workers World Party, were all splits from the Debsian Socialist Party. I can speak, a little bit to Socialist Party USA as a former member and friends with people who are still members. They are very much a multi-tendency party, much like the Green Party, which means that you have, Marxist-Leninists working alongside anarcho-communists, working alongside Maoists, right? And to varying degrees of success. When I was a member of the Socialist Party USA, it was in the middle of a big anarcho-communist swing. So it took a very strong swing to the bottom left, and I actually, from watching a little, I think it swung back again. And that's the reality, is these are small parties. If you show up with 100 people, you can move things in terms of the discussions. Socialist Alternative is a Trotskyite party. They're so that's their where they're coming from ideologically. PSL has trot roots in some ways. They also tend to float a little more top left nowadays towards MLM. I will, one thing I will say about PSL and the organization is, they organize themselves very much as a vanguard party, which means, they have very strict rules on, political education, and they're very centralized in their structure. Whereas the Green Party is very decentralized. And, the ideal of the Green Party, the power lies in locals, which then filters up to the state party, which then filters up to the National Federation. And we can have another conversation another time about whether that's successful or whether it can be successful. But that is a very different position than the Democratic centralism that is central to PSL. I'll say on the Communist Party USA, at this point, they're Democrats. When it comes to their electoral work, they endorse Democrat after Democrat when it comes to national politics. And, I think they have a new kind of rising, more radical youth perspective from my interactions online. But I'm 37, so when I was growing up, moving through socialist organizations, CPUSA wasn't even on the table because they were basically just a reformist organization. We've been very intentional about giving a Ecosocialism 101 workshop from a green perspective, and these kind of workshops would look very different coming from the different organizations and who they centered, who they quoted, that kind of stuff. So, I think what's important right now as socialists in the United States is to understand that if we all combined today, we'd still be minuscule. Not that electoralism should be used as um, overly important metric to our organizing. But if all the leftist parties in this country unified and voted for the same presidential candidate, we're still looking at maybe 2% on our best year. Right, so we're at a stage right now where I think we really need to, and we'll talk way more about this at the Organizing 101 next month. But I really think we need to embrace multiplicity of tactics, where we put away the Marxist-Leninist versus MLM versus anarchist fight, and work to support each other. Because this kind of goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, right? That we need to be make sure we're centering the values of what we're trying to build, and we need to, find common ground with these organizations. If you've got an active SPUSA in your area, I had my chapter is gone. It's a long story about why my chapter is gone, and it's why I'm not in SPUSA anymore. But when we had a socialist party in town, every single event that the Green Party or Socialist Party did, we both did. We were basically permanent. We weren't, we didn't merge organizations, but we were permanent collaborators with each other. If the Socialist Party had an idea for a rally, the Green Party almost always signed on, and vice versa. So I think that's where we need to be. We need, like we've said, no one's figured this out, right? If one of us had all the answers, we'd have a mass party to join. Right now, that's not the reality. And so the reality is we all need to accept that we don't have the answers. I always tell people, if you meet someone that thinks they have all the answers, you need to run, and you need to run fast, because that person has an agenda. You're probably not a core part of it, because nobody has these answers. So what we need to do, we need to center multiplicity of tactics. We need to center a radical solidarity that lets us give support to each other. And we need to kind of uplift and empower each other through all of our different organizations to see which one of us comes up with the idea, nails the tactic that all of a sudden gives us the avenue to build the mass party that we need to really affect change, the mass organization that we need to really affect change. So, I think that's where we're at when it comes to all these other organizations. We need to do a lot less of the, sectarian bickering about our specific policy points, and find points of unity and points of collaboration, because, it started at the First International, right? Where one group stormed out and didn't work with the other, and it's a generational, bad habit that we need to break on the left. When we start figuring things out, when people start actually building mass parties, then we can, get into working this stuff out. But right now we're fighting each other over to throw out a random number, the 10% we don't agree on, and we're ignoring the 90% we do. So I think that's really key for the left, especially in the United States. And this is something until I went to Europe and met with Greens in Europe, I never really grasped it. I never thought about, since we're in a U.S. centric discussion here, the complexities of organizing in a continental nation with 300 million people is just mind blowing. Right? The work that I need to do in Illinois is so different from the work Garrett needs to do, which is so different from the work of someone in Texas, which is so different from the work of someone in Washington or California or something, right? And so it's just, and when I talk with Dutch Greens, I realized they could get anywhere in the country in 2 hours by public transportation. Their right. Organizing models are just substantively different from ours. The challenges they face are just substantively different, and it's not just the the fact that they have proportional representation and all that kind of stuff. And fair ballot access. It's that geographics is an important part of how we organize.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in there and agree, but I something that comes up a lot, whether it's the Green Party or any other organization or party, is that it's so hard to organize. And usually folks will say that in kind of this negative context, like, oh, the Green Party doesn't have anyone in Congress, so I shouldn't bother, that kind of thing. And not to make it all about electoralism, but the point is more, I think a lot of folks don't realize, the challenges that we have organizing in the United States compared to, for example, say Europe, which is a lot more interconnected. In the EU. They have public transit. That's not really a thing that exists in most of the US. A lot of European cities are very urban, and a lot of the US is very rural. There's huge parts of it that are agricultural, like Chris was saying, in Illinois, and across the country. There's so many different ecologies. We go from forests to swamps to desert to to Arctic tundra, and a lot. There's so many different challenges and all involved in organizing the United States that we shouldn't get discouraged. But we should also, recognize that just because the Green Party in the US, for example, hasn't grown as quickly as the Green Party in Europe or Australia or something like that, it doesn't mean that we can't have a movement here. It just means that we have to think about it differently. We have to structure it differently because we're facing different challenges. We're facing different organizing conditions, different material conditions, as Chris was saying, right? So, solving all these answers or all these problems is part of our goal here, and that's why there is no one solution. There's no one blueprint on how to do this. Just every community, every region is going to have to do something a little bit different, and that's okay. Especially if, even though we're doing things a little bit differently, we have that radical solidarity, that we are there to support each other, to learn from each other, to present workshops like this and say, here's what I did in my community. It may or may not work for you, but I want to tell you what worked for us. And maybe that'll inspire people. Maybe we can literally send physical organizers to help people. We can send money to help people. There's ways we can express solidarity, even if we're not all doing the same thing. I think that's it. I saw you reaching for the bookshelf, Chris, so I wasn't sure if you had something else to add.
I was putting something away. I was putting the Rudolph Rocker away.
Oh, okay.
But so, yeah, to transition it out, like we have in the slide, we've got our Organizing 101 coming up next month. It's on June 28th at 8 p.m. You can go to greensocialist.net/101s and register. We'll also be streaming that one on YouTube like this one. So yeah, check us out, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.